Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight are my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. Shares from the Auckland University Department of TV, Film and Media Studies, torture film aficionado, and one of the best bloggers in New Zealand, Phoebe Fletcher. And he is the editor of one of the largest independent news sites in the country, scoop.co.nz, Selwyn Manning. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, week 2 of our 4-week election campaign. Who won? Who lost? Did Labour show us the money? Did their top 10 make a dent? And how have the minor parties fared? Issue 2, poll shows National's hardline welfare policy is a hit with Green and Labour Party voters. Are the poor no longer worthy of help and simply victims of their own misfortune in today's status culture? Issue 3. How dodgy is the V8 supercars coming to Auckland after the fiasco in Hamilton? And we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with issue 1. It's been week 2, and a line from a Tom Cruise movie seemed to have blotted out all other rational discussion. How did week 2 play out for the election, Selwyn? So Labour showed us the money, and it turns out that National's claims of overspending were mostly spin. Does anyone really care after the show me the money line has been replayed 1,000 times?
Well, if anyone does care, it's time to actually show that on November 26th.
Because it ain't looking good in the polls.
If the landline polls are accurate, it doesn't look good for Labour, does it? You know, what we're seeing is well below the 30% mark. Landline polls, we know, Bomber, you've said many times.
Many times.
You know, they're not that accurate in the sense that they're not going to all the people with cell phones who don't have a landline phone. A lot of people in key areas which would support a Labour and centre-left type of party.
Don't get represented at all.
They're not being asked, and I don't think the interest of the pollsters is there to ask them. But that aside, you know, they are a bit of a litmus test for the way trends are going. If we look at trends, Labour's got to pull a few hats, things out of the hat.
Anything out of the hat.
The economy. If people want to really have a look at that, look at the Treasury and Reserve Bank figures that came out Thursday. Yep. They don't look good for the government.
This is after the preview. This is after the
preview, and showing the quarter up to September 30th, and everything is going down. Tax take, the economy, the strength of the New Zealand economy, the New Zealand currency, the dollar,
it's
all
tanking,
going down.
We're actually tanking.
Yeah, and we're not even positioned to take advantage of a lower dollar through an export-led economy because there has been no R&D, research and development subsidy going out to the export market.
Show me the money.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all you got to do. It's
a comedy routine. It'd be like me sitting here getting the whole crowd against Phoebe, which would be impossible. And taking all the laugh and all the votes. You know, that's basically what it was. A comedy
that's what
routine.
You're seeing. It's remarkable
maybe
what pacifies New Zealanders.
Maybe our wonderful Prime Minister incumbent learned a few tricks on the David Letterman show.
Phoebe, it's interesting to hear some mainstream media punditry claiming that Labour wanted to stick to policy but then got personal by attacking John with a top 10 list. Yet the PM throws terms like drunken sailor around and went out and bet on a horse named Drunken Sailor in the Melbourne Cup. Is there a double standard here in favour of John Key? He can attack, but he can't be attacked.
I think there is a double standard, and just drawing from what Selwyn just said, I mean, we had Bill English on Q&A on Sunday morning admitting that the $5 to $7 billion that we would get from asset sales is overly optimistic. If you read people like the Economic Intelligence Unit, they are saying at the moment that China is actually very shaky. If you read people like Gareth Morgan, they're saying that the New Zealand market is floating on commodity prices. So, you know, in essence, the figures were actually more out on National's behalf. But I think what is happening here is this is part of the problem with elections in terms of running sort of presidential style campaigns, is that it tends to focus around personality. And, you know, this means that with the top 10 list and stuff like that, I don't think that was the best attack because New Zealanders have an aversion to personal attacks. It's an excuse that has been used many times. Helen Clark herself has used it a couple of times. It's kind of a New Zealand thing where we go, we don't like you being attacked.
Unless you're John Key.
Unless you're John Key.
John Key. Then
yeah, but
show me the money. Show me the money.
He has more rapport. I mean, but what they are actually floating this election on in terms of policy is asset sales, and that is something that is incredibly unpopular, even with their own voters. 51% of national voters don't want asset sales. So we have a very big split that is occurring between policy and personality, and unfortunately at the moment the personality is dictating this election. So
in a swag of mainstream media landline polls rushed out showing Labour in terminal decline. Who benefits from Labour's decline, and how terminal do you think it is?
On the first part, clearly the Greens have been picking up its fair share of that mainstream alternative vote coming out of the Labour camp. I do think that strong leadership has been in short order in the last Parliament, in the last 3 years. John Key, he's quick and he's decisive and he's popular from a decent bloke kind of point of view.
He's got comedic timing. He's got great comedic timing.
Absolutely, but I fail to see that he is a strong leader in the sense of strategic development, to strategically place New Zealand in its best possible space to benefit the people. As far as strong leadership is concerned, I do think that the Mana Party, for example, in looking at what Hone Harawira has been doing in the last couple of months, for those who want to look, there's someone there, that can help inject some debate into the new Parliament. Yeah. There's also, we do see Winston Peters sitting there just under, if you take the landline polls, under the 5%.
That's right.
Now, Winston Peters, we know, you never bet against Winston on these things, but we have seen a lack of experienced leadership in the last Parliament. Are people going to tune into that? Wait and see on 26th of November. Really.
Phoebe, could the inconceivable happen? The utterly inconceivable. Could National win a 50% majority? And if they could, what does that mean?
Ooh, well, it means that they can go it alone. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, there are still a couple of weeks left. Anything could happen during that time. A lot of the polls have been saying that they could win more than a 50% majority. If they do, that will be the first time since 1951 that anyone has won that kind of majority.
And never under MMP.
But I think that we are also seeing that, as Selwyn said, the smaller parties are picking up, but they seem to be taking up Labour's vote. So the latest Fairfax poll that came out, for example, found Labour down, I think it was about 5.2%, and those votes were largely leaching to the Greens and New Zealand First. So really, I mean, it really depends what happens in those last 2 weeks. We know that around a third of voters don't really make up their mind until they go to the polls.
What happens if they won? Let's just talk about doomsday. What happens if the national government get a complete majority and could do what they like?
Well, I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Is that it's not really quite MMP, and you're going to have parties and opposition that are trying to get stuff through that are not going to be able to. So, National getting that higher percentage of the vote is really a vote for a kind of first past the post kind of system, isn't it?
Yeah. So do you think MMP will if that happens, it's a direct consequence of MMP, and will MMP lose the referendum?
Oh, I mean, MMP has not been so good for the minor parties. That 5% threshold is actually pretty high. I mean, it's been good in terms of getting bills through and so on, but I wouldn't call it a consequence of MMP. I would call it a consequence of an extremely popular Prime Minister who is quite good at working the media and working the audience, and has gone through a series of national crises.
Just quickly on that point, I remember in an interview with David Longy years ago that I did when he was exiting Parliament in 1996, he actually predicted that over 10, 20 years, if MMP was sustained, that we would see a gravitation back to the two main parties. Maybe, we were not seeing that in the Labour instance in this, but maybe there's something there in his message.
Question to both of you, how have the minor parties fared? Who impressed and who didn't?
Well, the Greens, of course, have been doing very well and just going up and up and up.
Will it hold on election day, though? They always do this, don't they?
I think that Mana might pick up some of that transient vote, actually, because they've got, in terms of the polls that have been done on their voters, about half of their voters are Pākehā, so maybe they might get the so-called Stoner curse on the day. Conservatives, of course, we've had Colin Craig coming out and saying that he has a 10% margin on Mark Mitchell over last week.
A lot of criticism from our friend Cameron Slater
over busting,
you
know, the polls, right? Were actually done by a Conservative Party member for Research First, and the questions went along the lines of, you know, have you heard of the Conservative Party? Do you know Colin Craig? And if so, would you vote for Colin Craig? Who will you vote for? Which is obviously a very leading poll. ACT seem to be still floundering. They've come out with a range of policies which include increasing immigration and you know, loosening up on the Resource Management Act. Mana seem to be doing quite well. They seem to have targeted their audience very effectively. I mean, the Meet the Haraweras, for example, on the Jono show is
very
just
funny,
absolutely
isn't it?
hilarious.
Very funny.
You know, in terms of their audience of youth, they've got it on point.
Who's impressed in the minor parties?
Well, once again, Mana Party. You know, the more you look at the position they're doing, if you look at, for example, out in Manukau East, where John Minto's campaigning, he is really exposing what Labor has not done in the last 10, 15 years.
Did you see TV3 this week?
No, I didn't.
Where the reporter went out with a picture of the Labor Party candidate and no one recognized him.
Well, this is what we've been hearing. You know, Ross Roberts. Where have you been in the last 15 years? You know, to be fair, it did appear that Ross he reached his potential back around 1996.
Right.
Now that's just not good enough for the Labor machine. And whatever happens out there for Mana, you know, these kind of things where they're exposing the frailties of how the larger parties have abused their responsibilities, it is a really good thing.
Thank you, panel. Moving on to issue 2. Polls show National's hardline welfare policy as a hit with 25% of Greens and 21% of Labor Party voters. Are the poor no longer worthy of help and simply victims of their own misfortune in today's status culture? Selwyn Benjamin Franklin once described democracy as 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. With so many supporting draconian action against those on welfare, John Key has made a smart political decision by using beneficiaries as the nation's punching bags, hasn't it?
You know, this one really baffles me. You know, I always kind of take a view that the average Kiwi is one who will give another person a fair go. We on a global stage, we like peacekeeping. We do not like warmongering. This policy, getting the support of the public, particularly those who may vote Labor and Greens, you know, polls showing that this kind of policy, where it's kicked the woman in the guts type policies, this is. It astounds me. I just wonder once again, you know, just in what kind of environment those questions were placed. I like to think that the Kiwi punter wouldn't go that way. Really, at the end of the day...
Those are sizable chunks. Those are sizable
they are,
chunks.
but at the end of the day, the politicians have not addressed the core thing. You know, if you're going to look at the domestic purposes benefit, and let's scale that down to solo mothers looking after children, there's one huge thing that's absent here, and that's the male in the equation. You know, there is no politicising over, and let's face it, unless the male has passed away, which is a sad thing to go and then boot the woman into some sort of situation where she's got to scrounge for work. There's a male out there that has a tax number. He may be on a benefit, but he may not be. Now, why is there not a concerted effort to go and actually chase that person and to make sure they actually face their responsibility in the first instance? The state then pick up where there's a shortfall.
And Peter Dunn is certainly making moves on that, isn't he?
Peter Dunn Peter Dunn has put out that there are millions and millions and millions of dollars that are in arrears from men who are not facing their responsibilities. That's a sick situation. And it's about time our main politicians, John Key, stop kicking the women in the guts and the children by proxy and actually go after the men in the situation.
Phoebe, National understand the working poor hate those on benefits by targeting the lesser angels of our nature. The working poor end up supporting National Party policy, which is ultimately counterproductive to them. What are the pitfalls of such strategy to the wider community, though, if you do just target beneficiaries in this manner?
Well, there's a couple of points that I would make here, and the first point is that they've been very effective. And you know, John Key's basically stood down one end of the rugby field, kicked a rugby ball and said, New Zealand population, run over there. Okay, I was listening to Radio Live earlier on in the week, and Michael Law's talking about Labour's policy, for example, giving free dental care to women on the benefit, and you had people ringing in and saying that they were worried that women might get pregnant to get their teeth fixed. I was listening to this and thinking, of course, I want to run out and grab a sperm donor just so that I can get my teeth fixed. There's an irrationality about this, and you know, this irrationality largely derives from the fact that in New Zealand, the problem is not public debt, it is private debt. If you read through the last IMF report for New Zealand, the main problems are actually the amount of New Zealanders that are spending money on their credit cards, and they are largely middle class, and it is also the inflation of the property bubble to about 15% and rental prices to about, I think it was about 43.5%.
Caused by baby boomers.
Now,
and
if
that
we
has
talk
all
about
been
kind of
created
this
by the politicians with selling off.
If we talk about, sorry, just this beat up on women, you know, John Key has said, I think it was yesterday, that some of the impacts that this might have on beneficiaries are only, you know, really discussed in one 2010 Ministry of Social Development report. Well, that's not quite true. There's been a large amount of academic and, you know, Ministry of Social Development literature. For example, I was looking at a report from 2001 on the 1999 benefit reforms, where they said that, you know, this issue of pushing women out into work means that they largely go out, you know, about a third of women will go out into jobs that fall outside of non-working hours. Monica Quisa, who is head of social policy for the OECD, she came over in June, I think it was, and she was critiquing New Zealand because, you know, the thing is that out of 27 OECD countries, we are most unequal in terms of our spending on young versus poor, and it's actually superannuation that is costing half of our welfare benefit, and that population will double by 2051. Now, the other point there is that, you know, the recommendations that the Welfare Working Group brought in, they said that these should only be brought in if there is more spending on childcare, and that is not one thing that we have not seen yet. And Monica Quisa was also saying that it is impossible to compare New Zealand to Scandinavian countries because they have such a thing as a universal child benefit. So
Yep. It's those baby boomer locusts
and
again.
a commitment.
Helen Clark always knew that as a country we were redneck with a little R. Did Labour not lift beneficiaries out of poverty in the 9 years they were in power because they knew the backlash would be too great if they raised welfare?
You know, well, I was down there in the first rollout, and there was a policy called closing the gap.
That's right.
Unfortunately, within months, everybody was told, do not talk about closing the gaps. The word does not exist. The word group does not exist. What it was a response to a backlash from the rednecks.
Talk back radio.
That was feared that would be capitalised by a broken National Party at the time. Really, that signalled a real problem. We mentioned Ross Robertson. I don't want to make a scapegoat of Ross Robertson, do a John Key on this guy. He has served his community in the best way he can. He's a good man in many ways. But that is a demonstration to me where Labour has missed the opportunity of putting in new blood at the right time from the communities that really need to feed into their policy apparatus. Labour became more centralised as time went on, and we're seeing the consequence of that now.
Phoebe, I saw John Key last night in Helensville using one of his favourite lines, which is that in the 1970s, 2% of the population were on benefits. There are now 12% of the population on benefits. How does one counter his assertion that the benefit zombies are about to overrun civilization as we know it?
Well, I mean, the first point is exactly what I was saying before, that the majority of, you know, half of our welfare spending is going on super. And, you know, the reason why the National Party are not talking about that at the moment is that actually 49% of the population of New Zealand are over the age of 45. So that puts most voters, and actually the older that you get, the more likely you are to vote. I mean, the focus on solo mothers, that has really disturbed me from these comments by Key since the 1970s they've grown. Well, last time I checked, there was a bit of a social revolution that occurred in the 1960s. And first of all, that was the contraceptive pill and the advances made by women. Now, I really don't know how we're going to reduce the level of solo mothers back to the 70s without telling women to get back into the kitchen and depriving them of their rights.
This government masquerades, or this government that we currently have, the national-led government, masquerades as being fiscally prudent. And it's nonsense. If you look at the numbers, and if John Key went and got the numbers and where is the money and looked on that kind of thing, there is more to save from a coffer's point of view in getting the money from the men that owe money to Inland Revenue to pay their child.
Well, even David Cameron.
Than targeting those women. There is nothing to gain fiscally from targeting those women apart from stigmatising and creating a culture of nastiness.
Question to both of you. Key cleverly uses first world poverty now when describing those in poverty. Does the term mask the problem of poverty? And with the long-awaited global meltdown about to kick off, how long will we remain first world?
Well, you know, the so-called middle class in this country is now experiencing, probably for the first time, a huge ditch between those that John Key is looking after in the far right and the far wealthy kind of aspects of our socio-economic dimensions. What we're seeing is, again, a big ditch between the middle class and those who are not able to actually get there. Now, I kind of reflect back. Every person in this country, irrespective of their age, irrespective of their gender or their ethnicity, deserves a decent opportunity to actually assume their potential. What we're not seeing in this campaign, really, and I'm not seeing it from any of the parties, really, is a concerted effort to roll out policy that is going to actually allow and ensure that that comes through. Now, to reflect back on David Lange in the 1984 debate with Muldoon, he said everybody that we actually give assistance to reach their potential might not become a world star. Some people will be left behind, but everyone deserves the opportunity to get there. And that's something that I think is a challenge for this Parliament, and it hasn't done.
Phoebe, why do we hate people on welfare so much? Why do we hate them?
I think it revolves around that binary of work versus leisure, and I think that there's a kind of lack of discussion of the factors that lead to that. I mean, for example, watching TV3 this week was quite worried that there's more debate over a beneficiary's Sky dish, the $15 that she spends a week on a Sky dish, than there is debate about the actual facts and figures. And, you know, to kind of follow on from that, since the 1970s, we have increasingly globalised the New Zealand economy. So what we're looking at now is a very different environment than we had in the 70s. We can't simply just go back there.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. In their report into how Hamilton gained the V8 race, Audit New Zealand blamed Michael Redman as chief executive of Hamilton City Council for poor reporting, spending millions of dollars without authorisation, and keeping the council in the dark over the street race that cost ratepayers $37.4 million for the first 3 events. Selwyn, this would be hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. And we Aucklanders would laugh long and hard at our southern cousins in Hamilton if it wasn't for the fact that after this fiasco, the Super City hired Redmond to be the Super City's tourism and events boss, and somehow Redmond managed to cut a deal to get those bloody V8s to Auckland. How on earth has this been allowed to happen?
I don't know, Bomber. You know, when you put it like that, it's a bit of a joke, isn't it?
It's just extraordinary.
But it can be so funny sometimes that you cry.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe they've picked up a thing where people have had a guts full of listening to politicians making all the noise around, and it'd be far better to listen to V8s screaming around the streets. But the chances of having a successful campaign when you've had people having a chance at that before and have failed, well, we've got to really look at it in a clear and precise way, don't we?
Phoebe, Redmond originally wanted a budget in the Auckland Super City vision for events of $220 million. Thankfully, it was slashed to $110 million. But after reading New Zealand Audit's report, it would be difficult to trust Redmond with the milk money. How could we get so conned into a bloody car race?
It is strange, isn't it? I mean, the original budget, I think, was $7 million. By the time they committed to it, it was $18 million. It ended up costing $39 million. And this is something that ex-Hamilton Mayor Bob Simcock has been defending as being the result of, you know, the global recession. So, you know, it really is quite a worry. And I mean, the same thing with the Rugby World Cup. You had that creep where we have the council say it's $5.5 million of additional spending, whereas if you add up the amount that they've spent on infrastructure, it's around $70 million. So I think we really actually do need to look quite carefully at the way that these...
At what we spend our money on. I mean, we've talked for the bulk of this program on a real problem in New Zealand where people in our society are struggling. We know that. We see it, we hear it, we know people that are in that situation.
Money on a V8 car race?
There are times to be able to get out there and say, gee, we're great, let's have a good race around the track.
Yeah.
And there are times where you get down to your knitting and you get it right first. And this is one of those times. Instead of, we're not, I don't think we're subscribing to the view that we've got to be austere and we've got to be boring and all of that. People like their entertainment.
A poetry festival. Poetry festivals never get $40 million, do they?
No.
Ever. No.
Let's get the decisions right in the first instance.
But what a great poetry festival would be if we got filled in. Last question of both of you. Being a fan of The Simpsons, I have to ask, is the V8 race Auckland's own monorail? Is it? It kind of is, isn't it?
It kind of is. I mean, I'm not a big race car fan, so
It's the best of times.
I'm probably not the person to ask, yeah.
It's our monorail, isn't it? Monorail.
Wow, yeah. Might be.
Oh,
yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap this show with last word. How did that happen? Last word, Selwyn, your last word this week is?
Yeah, I just think that with this election campaign, people out there, don't be seduced by the showman. Get down to what's important to you. You know, look at your own household, look at your own circumstance, look at your family, your children, your wives, your partners, your extended whānau, and think what is going to be best for us, and vote on that. Don't be seduced by show me the money and all of this grandiose kind of comedy that we see on the stage and on these leaders' debates. Look at the policy, even if it only takes half an hour out of your time, and that's basically my final word.
Phoebe, your final word this week is?
Oh, well, I was going to echo Selwyn's words, but I'd also like to see a little bit more debate around growth. I mean, the issue with the people on benefits is that we need to have the jobs. Now, National's figure of 170,000 people off benefits, that was disputed by the Ministry of Economic Development back in June, as, you know, they said that there was no analysis that had been done into that and they had no idea where the jobs would come from. So I think both parties, you know, Labour and National, as those dominant parties, need to be discussing growth strategies that are a bit more new and innovative. Yeah.
Thank you, Selwyn. Thank you, Phoebe. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. National are running down government revenue so badly that they are justifying flogging off our assets to cover the taxation shortfall. But what is most disgusting about this short-term plan is that the education element is a smokescreen, because when Key says investment into infrastructure, he really means infrastructure investment into dairy irrigation, who continue to steal and pollute our diminishing water resources in the South Island. That's what we are selling our assets off for? South Island dairy industry interests? Shouldn't National be a little more honest? Surely allowing Bill English to have a dirty lignite production facility in his own electorate to power his brother's Federated Farmers industry cheaply was payment enough to the dairy industry. We have to flog off our assets to fund their irrigation as well. Why on earth are we funding a monopoly who benefit from our collective pristine environment, yet do some of the worst pollution damage? Even more corporate welfare while social services are slashed at the cost of our assets? If New Zealanders buy this cow shit, they deserve all they get. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens. And follow me on Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.